holds a BA from University of North Carolina, an MTS from Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of 4 books and numerous articles, and teaches on all aspects of Old Testament. In addition to his academic work, Professor Davis is active within the Down syndrome community and is a volunteer coach for the Wesley Stars Special Olympics swim team. So that's his official bio. I wanted to add something. It's very cool. I wanted to add something more personal too. I had Professor Davis as a first-year seminarian student, and it was a class called On Job and Suffering, and it was my first time as a disabled student to ever experience disability theology and to have language around narratives in the Bible about disability that were other than sin or healing. I didn't know that there was ways to think about disability as liberative, as triumphant, as collective liberation and healing. And when Andrew Davis shared that, it completely changed my life. And so I'm really grateful for that. And so here he is.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction. I'm honored to be with you this evening and this whole week at the Institute on Theology and Disability Conference. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to speak tonight. And in a special way, I want to give a special thank you to Michelle for that introduction and for reaching out to me to speak at this conference. I remember well our experience in Job together in that fateful spring of 2020 semester when COVID derailed everything. And I'll never forget the joy of exploring disability readings of Job with you, which was a transformative experience for me also. Thanks, of course, to all of you for being here also. And I want to say a special thank you to my wife, Emily, for being here, because tonight happens to be our wedding anniversary. 18 years. If you had told me tonight that 18 years in the future we would be celebrating our anniversary at the ITD conference, I would have said, "What? I can't hear you. The music's too loud." According to brides.com, the traditional gift for the 18th wedding anniversary is, does anyone know? Any guesses? Always diamonds. Academic conferences, that's a good one too. The answer is porcelain. That's brides.com for you. So that's my source. So I'm not sure what tonight's dinner plates are made of, but I can tell you we agreed this morning there's no place you'd rather be than with you here this evening for our anniversary. So while I'm talking about myself and my family, please allow me to give a brief personal background on my background with disability and the Bible. As a biblical scholar who teaches at the Cloud School of Theology and Ministry across the street, across Com Ave, I engage in different contextual approaches to the Bible and invite my students to explore all the ways that various communities have received the Bible. So I think I would have come across disability hermeneutics in one way or another, but this particular approach became personal to me when my son Peter was born with Down syndrome. I often think about how my work as a biblical scholar intersects with my life as a parent, and not just to Peter, but to his older brother and my typically developing son, Michael. With Peter, this reflection has brought me more deeply into disability readings of the Bible, and the engagement has been deeper and more personal for me than any other contextual approach that I study and teach. My exploration of disability studies and the Bible has been more than a personal project, however, which is good because the jury is still out on whether it has actually made me a better parent. I came to disability studies in part because of Peter, but I stayed because it has been an interpretive lens that has yielded unique insights. So that would be my slogan for disability hermeneutics. Come for the parenting insights, stay for the exegetical insights. My talk tonight will discuss one of those insights, biblical nut parenting, you'll be happy to know. Specifically, how disability studies can help all biblical scholars engage with the pluriformity of the Hebrew Bible. Pluriformity refers to the fact that several of the biblical books were circulated in different forms in the last 3 centuries of the BCE, reflecting textual plurality. In view of this plurality, we ought to ask ourselves which copies carried authority, some or all, and for whom. These are questions being asked by biblicists today concerning ancient audiences, but as I will show later in my talk this evening, they are questions that are also relevant for communities of readers today, including ours gathered here this evening, and I will demonstrate that disability studies has something to offer our understanding of pluriformity within biblical texts. Before I come to this discussion, however, I would like to spend the first half of my talk tonight making some remarks about the history of disability hermeneutics as a subdiscipline within biblical studies. My goal in these remarks is not simply to retell this history, which is probably already familiar to many of you, but to offer my opinion of its strengths and weaknesses from my perspective as 1, a biblical scholar, as 2, a professor at a school of theology and ministry, and 3, as a parent of a son with a disability. All 3 of these roles inform what I find most valuable in the subdiscipline and what I would like to see more of. And in the second half of my talk tonight, I will return to the question of pluriformity and how disability studies can facilitate the challenge it poses to biblical scholars. So first, my perspective on the subdiscipline of disability hermeneutics in the Bible. Like I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time rehearsing information that's familiar to many of you. Things like the subdiscipline's debt to Nancy Iceland's 1994 book, The Disabled God, or the 2004 establishment of a program unit at the Society of Biblical Literature dedicated to biblical scholarship and disabilities. What I'd like to do instead is to raise a question for us tonight, one that I think about often. The question is, how much should the subdiscipline of the Bible and disability studies focus on disability in its ancient settings? And how much should it focus on how present-day readers engage these depictions of disabilities? Or to put the question in a different way, should we focus on what the Bible meant, past tense, or should we focus on what these presentations of disabilities mean in the present tense? Or to ask the question one other way, this time with more hermeneutical language, should we focus more on the world behind the text, or should we focus more on the world in front of the text? You're probably thinking to yourself right now, why not both? And I agree with you. I'm always suspicious of either-or questions, and I think that they tend to overstate opposition and imply a false choice. Certainly, in this case, the very use of the word hermeneutics indicates that the ultimate goal is to build a bridge between the world behind the text and the world in front of the text, to fuse the horizons of the biblical authors depicting disabilities and of contemporary readers encountering those depictions. To keep the two separate is not only inadvisable, it's also probably not even possible. Nonetheless, if we survey studies of the Bible and disabilities over the 30 years since Iceland's book was published, I think we find that some works have tilted more to one side or the other. So the question I raise for us is not meant to reinforce a false dichotomy, but to provide a framework for critically assessing the scholarship of the past few decades. In my view, many of the best-known studies of the Bible and disability focus primarily or entirely on the world behind the text. They are interested in how disabilities functioned within their ancient settings. So, for example, the principal research question for Hector Avalos' important work, Illness and Healthcare in the Ancient Near East, from 1995, is this: how does a socio-religious conceptual framework affect and interact with the type of healthcare that a society devises for its members? The society he has in mind, though, is ancient Israel in the first millennium BCE. and it is left to readers to draw implications of his study for their own society. Similarly, in his 2008 book, Disability in the Hebrew Bible, Saul Olyan examines biblical representations of disability and situates them in their ancient contexts. He writes, and this is the quote I have for you, "Disability as an analytic category has the potential to help us gain deeper and more subtle understanding of the ways in which biblical writers construct hierarchically significant difference and privilege certain groups over others. Furthermore, disability as an axis of analysis also provides us with insights regarding the ways in which ancient interpreters of the Hebrew text preserve or modify early biblical notions and patterns of classification this is the key part. That's a long quote. That's probably too much for an oral presentation. But the key line here, for their own particular context and their own particular ends. And what I find, and as much as I love this book, the book has many terrific insights, but the one thing missing is attention to our particular context today. That almost all of Saul Olyan's book is dedicated to the particular context of the ancient authors and interpreters. So although Olyan mentions occasional parallels between the biblical notions of disability and contemporary Western ones, such comparisons are few, and there is no discussion of the role biblical texts have had in shaping those contemporary Western notions. So on the other end of the spectrum are works such as an essay by Jennifer Cousset and Darla Shum in a 2011 volume entitled Disability in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In their essay entitled Out of the Darkness, Examining the Rhetoric of Blindness in the Gospel of John, the authors ask this question about the story of the man born blind. They ask, who do we become as we enter into the relationship with the text of John 9? Not what did this text mean for the ancient authors, but who do we, the readers today, become when we interact with John 9? So mindful of the ways that exclusions from John's textual world can and do result in exclusions in the real world. For both ancient and modern readers, Cousset and Shum spend much of their article showing how exclusionary practices and attitudes make their way from John chapter 9 to contemporary churches and beyond, similar to the way the anti-Jewish rhetoric in John has shaped Christian practices and perspectives over the centuries. Their essay shows that it is possible to combine careful biblical criticism and at the same time be attentive to the ways that the implications of that criticism for readers today. Another example of this more contextual approach is The Bible and Disability, a commentary from 2017, which includes essays covering the entire biblical canon. As the editors note, quote, all the essays have in common a common concern to read the Bible through the lens of disability, and this is the key part, informed by the experience of human beings with disabilities. So informed by that experience, end quote. For some contributors, this lens includes an examination of the ways that biblical representations of disability interact with contemporary perspectives. So Jennifer Cousset, you can tell I like her work a lot, for example, explores how metaphors for the lover's body in Song of Songs are, quote, comic, repulsive, unruly, and uncompliant, especially uncompliant in conforming to norms and regulations, and thus provide all of us with opportunities to rethink our very notions of sex and beauty. So not just what the ancient authors thought of sex and beauty, but how our own perceptions of sex and beauty are transformed by reading Song of Songs. And J. Blake Cooey concludes his essay on the writing prophets with a discussion of 3 themes in these books, which resonates with contemporary experiences of disability: divine causation, the sensory character of religious experience, and social justice. As with Cousset and Shum, Cooey helps his readers apply his insights to their own lives. So the last 2 books I want to mention in this discussion are 2 by Jeremy Skipper, published 5 years apart, and I like them because I think they represent an interesting bridge between the two approaches that I've outlined. The first is his 2006 volume entitled Disability Studies and the Hebrew Bible, figuring Mephibosheth and the David story, in which he shows how the author of the David story uses Mephibosheth's disability to construct Israelite identity and to organize ideological positions related to national identity. Although in the introduction to the book, Skipper discusses how his own experience with disability has informed his interest and approach to his study, and in chapter 2, he discusses how interpreters over the centuries have interpreted Mephibosheth, he does not interrogate if disability serves similar ideological functions in the constructions of national identities today. So it's all rooted in ancient Israel, and no crossing into contemporary discourses takes place. 5 years later, though, Skipper published a book, Disability and Isaiah's Suffering Servant. And it, too, is primarily a work of biblical criticism focused on the social and political experience of the suffering servant described in Isaiah chapter 53. But this book differs from Skipper's 2006 volume in that his last chapter explicitly engages what his analysis means for readers today. Specifically, having shown how often the suffering servant has passed as able-bodied among interpreters, Skipper discusses how, quote, passing as able-bodied represents a dominant strategy for acceptance, if not survival, for many people with disabilities in real-life situations, end quote. The last line of his book reads, quote, studying Isaiah 53 in the context of disability studies does more than ask us who the servant is for each one of us. It asks us to state clearly how we have imagined and organized the biblical world, and whom have we allowed to occupy it, end quote. Here, I think it is possible to perceive a shift in Skipper's approach from 2006 to 2011, one that brings his work into more explicit engagement with the world in front of the text, without losing the excellence of his analysis of the world behind and in the text. In fact, Skipper himself addresses this shift somewhat in his introduction to the 2011 book. It's not exactly the point that I've made here tonight, but he does talk about how he sees it differently. He sees his work in 2011 differently than his 2006 volume. He writes about how his experience of giving lectures about the 2006 book made him question his past views of his own ability to pass as able-bodied in the world. He writes, this realization led me to reevaluate my strategies for interpreting disability in the Hebrew Bible, and to consider how the pressure to pass as able-bodied influences scholarship. While many people with disabilities are painfully aware of the pressure to pass on a daily basis, this issue has received little attention within disability scholarship, and virtually no attention within biblical scholarship interested in disability, end quote. What I find so important about this passage in Skipper's introduction is how something that happened in front of the text, something in his own life experience, led to a reevaluation of how he went about his biblical criticism. You might conclude from this whole discussion that I think scholars who study the Bible and disability should lean more into the world in front of the text, that they should focus more on what the Bible means for people today with disabilities, and how the texts have shaped public perceptions of disability. That conclusion is only partly true, however, because there's still a part of me, a big part of me actually, that loves the world behind the text. The whole reason that I became a biblical scholar myself is because I love ancient culture and literature, and I enjoy geeking out on the lives of ancient Israelites. So books and articles that discuss the Bible and disability only in their ancient context are still exciting to me. If Hector Avalos wants to teach me about healthcare in the ancient world, I'm here for it, whether he makes connections to the modern world or not. That's the biblical scholar part of me. There are other parts of me, however, that crave the more modern world connections. One part, for example, is my job as a professor at the Clough School of Theology and Ministry, where we are training students for careers in ministry and service. When students graduate, they will be working with all kinds of people, including people with disabilities. So they are most interested in how the biblical text can help them become better ministers. Most of them are also interested in what a text means in its ancient context, but the so what question is always looming nearby. If we look at a text with a character who's blind, they are curious about what the author's presuppositions and cultural background. But the ultimate question is, so what? How will this text help me be a better minister to people who are blind? How can this text help me interrogate my own assumptions about blindness and disabilities more broadly? For these questions, a strictly historical or critical analysis of the biblical text is insufficient. Such analyses are still worth reading with my students, but they require supplementation on my part and on theirs to bring the scholarship's insights to bear on the lives of human beings in our time and place. Another part of me is my role as a parent of a kid with a disability. Whenever I read an article or a book about disability in ancient Israel or in the Bible, part of my brain is always considering what this means for Peter, what this means for me as Peter's dad, what this means for the world we inhabit together. These questions cannot be answered only by the world behind the text. As with my students, some appropriation is necessary. That's why for my students and for myself, I am more often drawn to the works of scholars like Jennifer Cousset and Blake Cooey, who make that kind of translation to the modern world an explicit part of their scholarship. Even with their work, however, some further appropriation is necessary, as my students and I strive to bring the biblical text meaning to bear on our particular context. No one knows their context better than them, so it's up to them to carry the text that last little bit into their specific world. From this survey on scholarship and the Bible and disability, you can see that it ranges from the study of disability in its ancient context to studies that combine ancient and modern contexts. What is missing from this landscape of scholarship are works that focus mostly on the world in front of the text. Let me give you an example of what I have in mind, and this example will resonate with some of you who are at a session this afternoon. Last fall, I taught a seminar on the book of Genesis in which a student of mine did her presentation and her final paper on Joseph as a neurodivergent character. My student Madison highlighted various aspects of Joseph's character, which have sometimes puzzled interpreters. For example, his tendency to fixate on certain ideas and his lack of social awareness. Further, she proposed that Joseph's Technicolor dream coat, or more likely his coat with long sleeves, was a sensory accommodation. Madison argued that Joseph's neurodivergence lay at the heart of his conflict with his brothers, who misinterpret their father's accommodations for favoritism. But it's also his secret weapon, the unique gift that enables him to later plan for the coming famine in Egypt. Madison's classmates and I loved her presentation. Everyone in this seminar knew someone in their family, in their community, or in their ministry who was neurodivergent. And her analysis of Joseph gave them new ways to think about how they relate to these people in their lives. We discussed in her presentation dynamics between characters and how we see similar dynamics play out in our communities today. In short, her analysis bore tremendous fruit for how these students think about their relationships and their ministry. I will also add that the paper that Madison developed was excellent. But my reading of her paper was tinged with sadness, however, as I realized that an essay like hers would never be published in a biblical studies journal. As she noted herself in the paper, she was arguing that Joseph's neurodivergence was an interpretation of his character, not the interpretation. She conceded that her reading of his character is speculative, and that other interpretations are possible, and it's impossible to know if this aspect of his character was an intentional choice by the author of Genesis 37 to 50. Unfortunately, there are a few good venues for these kind of speculative readings of biblical text. Certainly, it would not find its way into biblical journals. But fortunately, I'm happy to say that ITD is one of those venues. And if you were at Samuel Levine's presentations this afternoon, you heard very similar presentations about Joseph neurodivergence. And when my student Madison was researching Joseph as a neurodivergent character, it was Professor Levine's book on Was Joseph on the Spectrum that was the only real resource you could find that explores this question. So it was a thrill to be able to attend your presentation this afternoon, Samuel, and to hear an affirmation of a very transformative presentation in my student seminar. So thank you. So the last point I want to make in this section is to return to Jeremy Skipper and another scholar, Candida Moss, in a volume they published together. And in the introduction to this edited volume, they give precedence to biblical scholarship done by biblical scholars. In this quote I have here, you can see that they prioritize, quote, research on disability done by specialists trained in biblical studies, who can provide a close reading of the Bible within its literary, cultural, or historical context. But it is telling that in the footnote they have to this very sentence, they admit that this does not mean that specialists can distinguish between what a text meant for its author or original audience as opposed to what it might mean for a contemporary audience. And so this is the gap that I think is so important for us to pay attention to. The gap between academic specialists and contemporary audiences is an important issue for all of us to address. So my question for us this evening that I hope we can maybe explore in the Q&A session is, who are the ones in the best position to help us move from what a text meant in its ancient setting to what it might mean for a contemporary audience? That gap is what Moss and Skipper have put their finger on, and it's a question that I think the field of biblical studies has not quite addressed or resolved. I would be interested in hearing your answer to that question about how to close this gap. And I have my own thoughts, but I'm sure yours will be better for us to hear. So instead of pursuing those questions right now, I'd like to move back to the question of pluriformity, which I introduced at the outset and which is actually in the title of the talk. And that is pluriformity and how disability studies can help biblical scholars engage the challenge of pluriformity. My interest in this topic is rooted in my conviction that disability studies has more to offer biblical studies than just a better understanding of disability in the Bible. It certainly does that, but as a hermeneutical approach, it can also help us think through interpretive challenges that have nothing to do with biblical study, with disability. The approach can train us, disability studies can train us to think in a certain way. And this training ends up becoming part of our scholarly analysis, even when we're not doing disability in the Bible as such. For me, this approach parallels many insights I've had as a parent of a son with Down syndrome, which has made me a better parent also to my typically developing son, Michael. For example, most of the advice my wife and I read in books about Down syndrome and parenting has been applicable to our son, Michael, as well. Kids with Down syndrome, we learned, thrive with structure and clear expectations. So does Michael. Kids with Down syndrome have different strengths and weaknesses and need to be allowed to show what they can do and what they need help with. That is no less true for Michael or really every other kid in the world. And so over and over again, something we learn through Down syndrome has applied to contexts beyond our parenting of Peter. I think that disability studies has a similar potential in biblical studies. It can offer insights on issues within the field beyond the particular topic of disability within the Bible. For me, pluriformity is one of those issues. So to refresh your memory, this is the quote from Emmanuel Tove, who's kind of the dean of textual criticism. Pluriformity refers to the fact that several of the biblical books were circulated in different forms during the last 3 centuries BCE, reflecting textual pluriformity. So a good example of this is the book of Jeremiah. So the book of Jeremiah, we find significant differences between the Hebrew or Masoretic version of the text and the Greek or Septuagint. So the Masoretic text is a medieval manuscript tradition based on ancient Hebrew copies. It's basically the basis of our modern biblical translations of the Hebrew Bible today. The Septuagint is a 3rd century BCE translation by Jewish scholars into Greek. When fewer Hebrew speakers, they needed a Greek translation, and so they translated the Bible into Greek, which we call the Septuagint. Here's the problem with the book of Jeremiah is that the Greek version of Jeremiah is 1/8 shorter than the Hebrew version. A whole 1/8 of the book is shorter. That's 2,700 words in the Hebrew version are missing in the Greek text. We also find that certain chapters are in different locations. Chapters 46 through 51, for example, in the Masoretic text, occur in the Greek version after chapter 25. In addition to these big picture differences, there are also smaller variants, places where the Greek text simply doesn't match the Hebrew. For a long time, scholars attributed these differences to the Greek translator's desire to streamline the Hebrew text. And sometimes the differences were chalked up as translator's sloppiness. But those views are hard to maintain because, for the most part, Greek translators followed the Hebrew text closely, even sometimes producing a fairly wooden translation. More recently, scholars have concluded that the Septuagint, the Greek text of Jeremiah, is a Greek translation of a Hebrew version that was simply different from the Masoretic one. Simply put, there was more than one Hebrew version of Jeremiah floating around ancient Judah. One version of the Hebrew text became the Masoretic text, which is the basis of all of our modern Bibles. Another one got preserved in the Greek translation, and there were probably more, though, as we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is the challenge of textual pluriformity. And the question is, how does this multiplicity affect our interpretation of the Bible? Many scholars simply choose one translation, usually the Masoretic text, and go with it. But other scholars insist that we have to reckon with the multiple textual witnesses in our interpretation of the book. So this is a quote from Georg Fischer, a scholar. He's a Jesuit in Austria. Fischer writes that the book of Jeremiah offers not one theology, but several testifying to disputes concerning the perception of God and God's action in the world. To illustrate this challenge, so the basic challenge is that there is more than one version of Jeremiah floating around. There's multiple versions. So why do we just go with one version? And how can we embrace the pluriformity of this text in all its complexity? So to illustrate this challenge, let's take a look, for example, at a particular text from Jeremiah. So this is Jeremiah chapter 31. Here it is in the Hebrew Masoretic version. See, I am going to bring them from the land of the north. This is Jeremiah announcing the return from exile for the Judean exiles. So they're coming from Babylon back to Jerusalem. So God is promising, I'm going to bring them from the land of the north, gather them from the farthest parts of the earth, among them the blind and the lame, those with child and those in labor together. A great company, they shall return there. With weeping they shall come, and with consolations I will lead them back. I will let them walk by brooks of water in a straight path where they will not stumble. Numerous scholars have highlighted this passage's affirming vision of inclusion. Rebecca Raphael, in her book, Biblical Corpora, writes, if anyone wants a proof text for universal design, here it is. Saul Olyan, in his book, calls it one of several utopian visions which describe Hashem acting to change the circumstances of persons with disabilities in order to include them in his scenario of salvation. Indeed, Jeremiah 31 verse 8 is one of the rare depictions of disability in the Bible that does not involve a healing. Instead, God accommodates disability by bringing the blind and the lame and pregnant to a straight path where they will not stumble. The adjustment is an environmental one, not a change to their personhood. These people make the journey just as they are, joined together, yachdav, with the rest of the great company, kahal gadol, of returnees. When we turn to the Septuagint translation, however, we find a different version of the text with a significant difference. So the biggest change is that the references to the blind and the lame are gone. In place of the blind and the lame is a reference to the feast of Passover. The difference here turns on the Hebrew root pesach, which means to limp, but also gives us the word for lame, peseach, in verse 8 from the Hebrew version. This root also gives us the word for Passover, the Hebrew word for Passover, pesach, since Hashem passes or literally hops over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. So the different connotations of this root pesach, both meaning to be lame, but also Pesach, Passover, explains the variation between the two texts. But we are left with the challenge of how this variation affects our interpretation. Should it affect our interpretation? Within scholarship of the Bible and disability, there has been no effect on interpretation. Much scholarship on disability references Jeremiah 31:8, but in all of these works, there is no mention of the variant reading in the Septuagint. On the other hand, scholars who insist that we take textual traditions into account seem to be totally unaware of the significance of this verse within disability hermeneutics. They explain the issue of the root pesach, but they offer little with what its variation means for interpretation. Or to put it in the framework of my earlier discussion, most biblical scholars are good at explaining the differences within the text, but they are less attentive to the differences, what these differences might mean to readers in front of the text. Here is where I think some insights from disability studies can be helpful as we confront the kind of multiplicity that we find in Jeremiah 31:8 and 9. My idea of using disability studies as a lens for textual pluriformity arose out of my observation that textual criticism of biblical manuscripts sometimes uses language reminiscent of the marginalization experienced by persons with disabilities. For example, in text criticism, it's not unusual to encounter the word inferior to describe textual witnesses that in some way deviate from what a scholar has determined to be the quote-unquote original text. The quote original or pristine text then becomes the established norm, and any variation from this norm is considered an inferiority. More recently, that is to say, in the decades since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars have recognized that textual variants have equal status and equal claim to originality. But in my view, this new perspective is missing from many interpretations of Scripture, which continue to prioritize one textual witness over others, or simply to ignore it altogether. When faced with a situation like Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, a scholar might well decide that one text is the original and dispense with the others as inferior. In my reflections on the challenge of textual pluriformity, I began to wonder what disability studies can offer us as a way of engaging the biblical sources with more inclusivity. After all, this field has interrogated the ways in which an established norm has led to the marginalization of others whose difference has become synonymous with inferior. This history of marginalization is familiar to everyone at this conference and has recently been examined from a theological perspective by my colleague at the CSTM, Dr. Mary Jo Iozio, in her 2023 book, Disability Ethics and Preferential Justice, A Catholic Perspective. And she's also a featured speaker here on Thursday at 11:15. Part of Mary Jo's book is dedicated to giving an account of past and present exclusion and discrimination suffered by persons with disabilities. But she also makes a case for a more inclusive theological anthropology, one built around shared dependence on each other. She writes, quote, "Affirmation of people with disability will include recognition of diversity in creation, inclusive of the diversity across the spectrum of ability, as well as the dependence that is the reality of all humankind upon the webs of relationship that beget, befriend, and support each and every one of us," end quote. For me, this quote could easily be adapted to the world of textual criticism as an approach to biblical pluriformity. Such an adaptation would involve the recognition of textual diversity and composition inclusive of the diversity across the spectrum of textual witnesses. It would mean not focusing on the Hebrew Masoretic text to the exclusion of other textual witnesses, such as the Greek Septuagint or the biblical manuscripts from Qumran. All of these manuscripts were authoritative for some group of Jews in the ancient world. But we only choose one as authoritative for us, and so there's a diversity of the biblical text within its ancient setting that does not carry over as diversity within our modern readings. It would involve the recognition that all these textual witnesses are part of a diverse collection we call the Bible, and that the overall meaning of Scripture is dependent on their collective witness. To me, this is how disability studies can help biblical scholars engage the challenge of pluriformity. Perhaps just as importantly, disability studies can also teach us the dangers of not approaching this inclusive approach to pluriformity. When biblical scholars focus only on what they consider to be the best, or the original, or the pristine text, to the exclusion of other textual witnesses, it should come as no surprise that their interpretation often reinforces social, cultural, and religious hierarchies, which have been harmful to people with disabilities. As the old saying goes, how you do one thing is how you do everything. So if biblical scholars adopt the framework of best and inferior when it comes to text criticism, this framework will likely carry over into their analysis of the text itself. If we want more inclusive interpretations of the Scripture, we should begin with more inclusive approaches to the plurality of manuscripts that make up Scripture. I'm not saying this is easy. In fact, it's quite difficult, and if there are any biblical scholars in the room tonight, you're probably thinking that this approach I'm advocating is totally impractical. I'm planning to give a version of this talk at a biblical colloquium next year, and I'm anticipating that will be the feedback I get at that colloquium. And it is impractical, and there is even a danger of too much pluriformity. Textually, it is possible that you could spend all your time negotiating various textual witnesses and never get around to interpreting the text itself. So for biblical scholars, the challenge is to strike a balance between openness to the Bible's inherent pluriformity and the exegetical work itself. To conclude my talk tonight and to illustrate what this pluriformity might look like, let's return briefly to the two textual different readings of Jeremiah 31, verses 8 and 9. The Masoretic text reads, "See, I am going to bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the farthest parts of the earth, among them the blind and the lame." And the Greek Septuagint reading, "Behold, I am bringing them from the north, I will gather them from the farthest parts of the earth at the feast of Passover." Is there a way to acknowledge the difference between the two texts and to accept the text critical explanation of their variation, but still read them together? Specifically, what would it look like if we read the ingathering of the blind and the lame and those with child at the feast of the Passover, so that the Passover setting is not an alternative reading, but further information about the homecoming celebration of these exiled Judeans? In this combined reading, the Judeans returning from exile are not only coming home along the roads specially designed for their mobility, but they are coming home to join the great assembly, the Kahal Gadol, who will celebrate the Passover upon their arrival back in Jerusalem. We know from Ezra and Nehemiah that the first Passover celebrated at the rebuilt temple after the exile was a momentous occasion for the community of returnees. And we also know from texts like 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 8, that people with disabilities were not always welcome in the temple for such celebrations. So in this combined reading of the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, they combine for a fuller picture of what the homecoming of the returnees with disabilities, one that includes their participation in the communal worship of the post-exilic community. This is just one example of pluriformity out of many others in the book of Jeremiah and many more throughout the Hebrew Bible. I chose this passage because it is a passage that has been very impactful within disability hermeneutics. For me, this combined reading of Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 8 and 9 is an attractive one, but I don't know how often such combinations are feasible. At the very least, though, I think biblical scholars are obliged to explore more creative ways to read multiple textual witnesses together, even if we find that they don't work in the end. For me, this commitment for inclusive reading comes from my work within disability hermeneutics, which resists hierarchical arrangements of the quote-unquote pristine and the quote-unquote inferior. If we are serious about this kind of inclusion, it must apply to all parts of our scholarly enterprise. For me, as a biblical scholar, that means remaining open to the pluriformity of the biblical text, even though it may be the last thing people think about when they think about the Bible and disability. This leads me to my concluding question to you as we turn to our conversation tonight and throughout the week. For you, what are some hidden corners of your field that may not have to do with disability per se, but for which a more inclusive approach can be inspired by disability studies? Thank you. Now we have time for question and answers and discussion, but we have a practice at BC in our continuing ed program where you've been listening, thank you, quietly this whole time and passively. And so we like to hand it over to you to talk in your small group and just share some thoughts, reflections, objections, or questions you may have as a way to get the conversation flowing. So for the next 2 or 3 minutes, I invite you to turn to your neighbor and just share something from the talk or something, anything today that you would like to share with your neighbor. And then after a few minutes of that, I'll call you back and we can maybe have some discussion in a larger group. So please turn to your neighbor and have some small talk. So, any thoughts or yes?
I was just sharing, you got me going off on one of my kind of favorite things about this over time. Some people here know what I'm going to say, but it's over time, when people have asked me to say, well, how do you do this with a person with a disability? Or how do we know they understand communion like a person with intellectual disability? The technique is to reverse the question. We say, how does anybody else understand it? Mm-hmm. Or how do we know anybody else understands it? You know, that to flip that question around and to say, wait a minute, you start with what do we think about it with anybody else? But then, while you figure out what to do in some ways that maybe enhances understanding or deal with specifics, it's not just flipping the question around, it's flipping the answer around and say, this is good for everybody else too, just like you were talking about with your sons and your kids with disabilities. Yeah. And I tried to write something about this a couple of years ago for a paper that I taught, and then I realized there's a whole name for it in disability studies called the curb cut effect. Mm-hmm. Which would be so that when you made a curb cut, then what's often happens, you do something designed for people with disabilities, it ends up being good for everybody else. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where all the OXO kitchen tools came from. You know, it's where curb cuts came from, all these other kinds of strategies. So it's almost like, write a paper for us on the curb cut effect in biblical studies. And,
Yeah, thank you. I think that's the next step in disability studies in the Bible, to be honest with you. I think most of the work has been done on disability readings of disability as such, but I think there's all sorts of other ways that it could branch out into other parts of the field that that aren't explicitly about biblical studies, but could benefit from the unique perspective that disability studies brings.
I love your input and backup.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have a question from the online audience. Someone asks, can you comment on the connection, if any, between the incurable wound in Jeremiah 30 and the inclusion of people who need adaptable walkways in Jeremiah 31?
I mean, they're connected in the sense that they're both in Jeremiah, but I think that that would be, I guess, to say the obvious. But I think that there are two. Another important strand of disability studies in Jeremiah has been around the figure of Jeremiah himself as a suffering prophet and someone whose prophetic ministry comes at a great personal cost. And so the incurable wound, I think, is related to a lot of the heart imagery within Jeremiah and the way that he internalizes the sort of pain of his prophetic ministry. Whereas I think the folks described in chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, would be the exiles in Babylon, of which Jeremiah was not a part. He wasn't part of that group that went into Babylon. And so it would be more a part, the people that Jeremiah is ministering to, and not Jeremiah's own kind of personal bodily pain and grappling with his ministry. I think there's a... Very...
I wanted to ask you, on Jeremiah, I just opened the, right? And it said about this piseach, this limping person, and it's take together not just the disabled, it's quote the pregnant woman, right? And they are all the Kahal Gadol. They are all those people that will come, and he will bring them in a very straight way path without any obstacle, right? And now I'm asking myself, this Piseach, and you refer to Pesach, that it's the same root of the word, and to Pesach, it's to pass over. It's to pass over something, right?
Right.
And it can be from an intention that you are caring for this person, and this is why you are pass over. And it can be because you ignore him, and he is nothing for you, and this is the reason that you are pass over him.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
How do you see it?
How do I personally? I think the very fact. I guess for me, what's gratifying is this: is you're asking that very question. I think that to bring both of these together and to ask, what does it mean to play with this root? I think within Christian and Jewish tradition, we often are looking to our tradition and how maybe the rabbis are playing with different roots or spinning things in different ways, or how people in Christian tradition are spinning things in different ways. But I think that kind of interpretive exploration can take place within the biblical manuscripts themselves. And so I would also even say that, the root Pesach could also mean to dance, that it's just kind of one-footed dance in other biblical passages. So there's all sorts of ways that you could spin out theologically what it means to Pesach. And clearly different biblical translators, the biblical authors themselves, we're exploring different meanings of that root. So exactly what theology we build from this. I could give you my own answer. It was kind of in the paper itself, and just seeing that it's not just a matter of these Pesach, these lame, coming back from exile, but coming back and participating within the Passover celebration in Jerusalem. So it's not just come back to Jerusalem and live on the margins, come back to Jerusalem and be here at the temple celebrating this momentous Pesach with us. And so, that to me is the fruit of reading them together. But I think if we all kind of reflected, we could come up with different theological, and for our own ministries and contexts, it might mean something different. But I think just attending to that difference and that plurality, and recognizing that it opens up theological opportunities for us that we don't encounter if we're not noticing the different textual witnesses. So I have a question for you. So I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mentioned there's the Hebrew version and the Greek version of Jeremiah. Which one do you think they had at Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls? Any guesses? So we had the Greek version of Jeremiah. We had the Hebrew version of Jeremiah. Which one do you think they had in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Both. Who said both? Yes, both. It's always both. Any either or question, the answer is always both and. And so incredibly, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's written in Hebrew. They're all written in Hebrew, but one of the Hebrew manuscripts seems to be the Hebrew manuscript on which the Greek version was based. And so we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you had this Jewish sect living around the Dead Sea, in the centuries 2nd and 1st century BCE, and they have multiple copies, different copies of the book of Jeremiah within their sacred text, so their own sacred library, and this living, breathing Jewish community has different copies that they regard as authoritative. And so it's not unprecedented that we would have interpreting communities within Judaism and Christianity that are used to handling different textual witnesses. The Qumran community was able to do it, so I don't know why we couldn't do it also. Yes.
I am not in any way a theologian and know absolutely nothing about ancient sacred texts. I'm a Christian by tradition, but I followed your talk very carefully. And what it suggests to me also is that this approach can be applied to the sacred stories of different faith communities in terms of not placing hierarchy and not elevating one over another.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think anytime you're dealing with kind of plurality, multiplicity, and the challenge of being open to that kind of plurality, I think it ends up deconstructing hierarchy in ways that are often very liberative for people. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a lot of questions in my mind because I'm not a biblical scholar, but I have a little bit of biblical training because I'm theological students. So when I hear your presentation, I wonder whether the distinction between eisegesis and exegesis still become a problem in the biblical word, because so I studied for my bachelor in theology in Indonesia. Mm-hmm. So my professor in the Bible, they tend to convince us not to do the reading from the front of what is the term?
The world in front of the text.
The front of the text, because that will be dangerous according to them.
Yes.
Maybe there are development on this, or so the term of eisegesis and exegesis. That's my first question. And then the second one, so far I learned about disability theology. It's transdisciplinary rather than one discipline doing the theology of disability. But I also realize there is a tendency between biblical scholars, systematic theologian, ethicists. Mm-hmm. So do you think, as this still happening until now, it's possible to do both the reading in front of the text and behind the text to find the meaning? And then the third one, I imagine the context of Bible study in the local congregation. If there is a biblical scholar there and one person with disability there who has no train on Bible at all, what kind of conversation that you imagine will have? Because in disability studies, I learned the people with disability are the experts of their own bodily experience, while biblical scholars tend to feel they are also the experts of doing the biblical study.
That doesn't like me at all.
I mean, what when I imagine this kind of scenario,
Yeah.
what will happen in this Bible study? Reading the same text, people with disability as the expertise of their own experience, and the biblical scholar as the expertise of their own field. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are three great questions. I mean, as far as the first one, I would say that I think some eisegesis is inevitable. I hope your teachers aren't watching this live stream. They would probably turn it off at this point. But I think in essence, I think it's impossible to do any sort of interpretation and not have your own positionality as a reader-interpreter influence the way you're reading it. And so I think the best thing we can do, I think, is to be transparent about what our positionality is and to be clear about how that is maybe shaping our interpretation, and to acknowledge the ways that our own positionality is causing us to read the text in certain ways. And so I think eisegesis is inevitable, and people who say that that is not a challenge for them, I think, are the readings I'm most suspicious of, because I think it's just a part of interpretation. And so for my students, I mean, they're coming from different countries, different sexual orientations, different genders, different everything, and all that makes a difference in how they're reading the text. And so I think to pretend otherwise is, I think, a naive reading of the text. And so I know eisegesis is a bad word in a lot of biblical studies, but I think I would just say kind of recognizing our own positionality and how that affects the interpretations we come up with, I think, is, to me, the only responsible way to read Scripture. In terms of interdisciplinarity, I was actually thinking of this with your question, because with the women, I was thinking with your question, you touched on the women who are in labor. I mean, a lot of this passage has gotten a lot of attention from feminist criticism also, and the ways that this passage says something about the way Jeremiah thinks about pregnancy and women, and so this would be a great example in another talk of intersectionality within biblical studies, and how this text is an opportunity to think about both feminist criticism but also disability criticism, and how do they overlap with each other, and how the particular positionalities of disability studies or feminist criticism converge here, and in what ways are they illuminating different facets of this passage. And so I wouldn't necessarily see it so much in terms of systematic theologians or ethicists, but for me as a biblicist, I often think more in terms of particular context of reading. And so what does a post-colonial approach to this passage take? What would be a feminist approach to this take? And seeing how disability studies can be a conversation partner with these other criticisms. And the last one, in terms of like a practical application, I mean, to me, I totally agree. I would never want to tokenize somebody, and nothing drives me crazier than biblical scholars who have to be an authority in every context they find themselves in. So for me, what I find most helpful, and this is kind of my approach in class, is just give people the text and ask them what they think about it. And, look at this. What do you think this text would mean for someone with a disability? What do you think this text would mean for somebody from, the global South? What do you think this text would mean? And just to ask questions, to open it up. And in that case, no one's the expert and everyone's the expert at the same time. And so I think, to me, just starting with the text and giving people the text in its kind of multiplicity, and then asking questions that go from there, and not coming in with an agenda, but just seeing what comes up, to me, is the way to open conversation, and not force it into sort of whatever the authority in the room thinks it should be.
Well, the last point that you made in response would seem to indicate, although this wouldn't be as popular in some circles, that a person with disabilities is not necessarily an infallible expert on the experience of people with disabilities.
I agree with that.
So marginalizing somebody out of the room, you might say, can come from either side. That even biblical scholars may have something to add.
Yes. Biblical scholars are people too.
Give Dr. Davis a hand and thank him
All right,
for this
thank
talk.
you very much. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.